Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead the moment I got locked out of the office on the very day my name vanished from every boardroom email. Clive. 48 accountant by trade, fingers clenched around my father's old silver pocket watch, its cold weight a reminder of promises broken and battles yet to come. Ever been erased from your own story? Tell me what you'd do next. The maple leaves skittered across the narrow window ledge of my office, scratching at the glass like they were trying to get inside. I'd left the window cracked, even though the early autumn air had a bite to it. The sound of the wind kept me anchored, kept me from staring too long at the computer screen, where Lenora's wedding countdown timer flashed in the corner. My sister, 4 years younger but a lifetime apart, had sent me a single-line message the week before. We'll stream it for you, Clive. Zoom link attached. No invitation, no seat at the table, just a link. That might have stung less if I hadn't wired $100,000 to her wedding fund just 2 months earlier. I pressed my thumb against my father's old silver pocket watch, through the wool of my vest, feeling its cold weight like a pebble in a shoe. The watch had been his idea of a legacy, passed to me with little ceremony, when he decided Lenora deserved the spotlight more than I ever would. Its face was worn smooth from decades of hands other than mine, its tick steady and detached, as if time itself couldn't be bothered to care about who paid for what, or who was left standing on the outside looking in. I wound it once more, to hear the faint click, then out of any need to keep it running. Time felt louder than the Zoom chime that announced the meeting was starting. The Vineyards event hall came to life on my laptop, a place I'd driven past on more than a few late nights, but never stepped inside. Strings of golden lights crisscrossed the high rafters, catching the sheen of crystal chandeliers. Guests in sleek suits and jewel-toned dresses clustered around long tables covered in linen champagne flutes, in hand smiling for the cameras like they were all auditioning for a lifestyle commercial. Lenora moved through them effortlessly, the pale silk of her gown trailing behind her like mist, Marcus glued to her side, with the practiced grin of a man who'd spent a lifetime closing deals. She raised a glass, her laughter smooth and buoyant, and said, "Here's to family, to generosity, to everything we've built together." I almost laughed at the word together as it drifted through my tinny laptop speakers. I sipped the lukewarm coffee sitting on my desk instead and opened a new email tab. The subject line wrote itself, "Withdrawal authorization." My fingers hovered for a second, not because I doubted the choice, but because I wanted to savor the stillness before the tide turned. Through the speakers, I could hear someone strike a fork against a glass, summoning the room's attention for a toast. The wedding planner, a lean man with a permanently harried expression, moved briskly behind Lenora, whispering to a server. My cursor blinked patient. I typed out the directive to the Family Foundation, cancel the $100,000 transfer effective immediately, before the bank finalized the wire. One click, a muted ding, and the email was gone. On the screen, nothing changed at first. The Vineyard Hall still glowed, Lenora's smile still bright as she gestured toward the guests. Then I saw the planner's face stiffen as he checked his phone, his eyes darting toward Marcus, whose grin faltered just enough to betray the calculation behind it. A murmur rippled across the tables like a slow-moving wind through dry grass. One of the caterers whispered to another, their trays dipping as they caught the news. Somewhere off camera, a champagne flute hit tile and shattered the crack, echoing louder than Lenora's rehearsed speech. Her microphone, so careful to catch her every polished word, betrayed her now. I heard her voice, low, but edged, hitch on a breath. "Clive, what have you done?" The room around her kept moving, polite laughter filling the air, but her tone cut through it like a blade. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that she didn't already know, nothing worth spelling out, while the wires of her perfect night unraveled one by one. I clicked leave meeting the Vineyard Hall, disappearing into the familiar gray of my desktop screen. The chatter faded, replaced by the faint hum of the radiator and the steady tick of the pocket watch in my vest. It was louder now, or maybe I was just listening differently. I set my coffee aside, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence settle around me like a heavy coat. The leaves outside scraped again against the glass, their sound mingling with the metronome beat of the watch. I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of its chill metal, and stared at the darkened screen where Lenora's face had been. For the first time in a long while, the ticking didn't feel like a reminder of what I owed to others. It felt like a countdown, one I finally intended to use for myself. The first time my father pressed that silver pocket watch into my palm, it wasn't a gesture of pride. It was a transaction. The summer of 2016, the air smelled like honeysuckle and exhaust outside the Vineyard's boardroom as he said, "Help her shine, Clive. You keep things balanced. That's your gift." Lenora had just pitched her latest PR venture, a glossy branding firm she claimed would elevate our family's name. I was the one cutting the checks, mapping the budgets, quietly shifting numbers in our accounts to make it possible. She didn't look at me when she thanked us. She looked past me, straight at the window, where her reflection gleamed in the glass, already seeing herself as the face of something bigger. That watch was supposed to mean legacy, a tether to the Reddick line, but it felt cold against my skin even then. Its steady tick reminded me that in our family time didn't measure effort or sacrifice. It measured how long you could hold your tongue while someone else stood in your place. I remember turning it over that night, staring at the faint scratches on its back, wondering how many hands had held it before me, and how many of them had been told to stay in the background. By the following summer, Lenora's face was printed on banners strung across the town square during the annual BBQ fundraiser. Her firm's logo, all sharp lines and elegant serif letters, sat beneath her smiling portrait, like she'd been single-handedly carrying the town on her back. I stood behind the grill that day, flipping burgers while the July sun turned my shirt, damp and sticky, my name absent from every donor list posted along the church fence. The crowd cheered when Lenora took the microphone to thank everyone for believing in our family's vision. My hands smelled like charcoal and grease. Hers, I imagine, like the lavender lotion she carried everywhere. After the smoke cleared and the last of the paper plates were tossed, Dad found me stacking folding chairs near the church steps. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, heavy but distracted his eyes, following Lenora as she posed for photos with the mayor. "You don't need the spotlight," he murmured, his voice almost drowned out by the buzz of the cicadas. "She does." He handed me a plate of leftover coleslaw like a peace offering and walked away before I could answer. The watch in my pocket ticked louder than his words, a sound only I seemed to hear. By late 2019, the ledger on my desk had grown thick with red circles around Lenora's projects, each one tied to funds I'd quietly authorized. My handwriting filled every column, calculations for payroll, projected returns, tax buffers, all the invisible threads that kept her ventures from unraveling. One evening after another, 12-hour day spent balancing her accounts, my phone buzzed. A press release hit my inbox, a draft I'd written to announce her firm's expansion into 3 new states. Only now my name was gone. Where I had signed, prepared by Clive Reddick, there was nothing but white space. Lenora's name, bold and centered, stood alone at the top. I printed the email more out of habit than protest and taped it to the inside of my ledger. The edges curled over time, the ink fading, but the absence of my name stayed sharp as a blade. A smudged BBQ receipt hung beside it on the bulletin board, grease-stained and curling, another reminder of where I stood in the hierarchy of our family triumphs. Sometimes, when the office was silent, except for the hum of the HVAC. I'd open the ledger just to watch the second hand of the pocket watch move in time with my notes. Each tick felt like a rebuttal. I never voiced a quiet protest in the face of a family that only measured worth by how loudly your name echoed in a room. I ran my thumb over the watch's cool surface and stared at the red ink circling Lenora's ventures. My own name, faintly penciled on a few older pages, was nearly rubbed away from years of revisions. The cicadas outside had gone quiet by then, the town wrapped in that heavy stillness Vermont gets before the first frost. I closed the ledger slowly, the watch still ticking in my palm, and let my gaze linger on the fading printout taped inside. It wasn't anger that welled up, not yet. Just the deep, familiar ache of a man who realized he'd spent years building a foundation for someone else's spotlight while his own shadow stretched longer across the floor. As the last light of evening leaked through the blinds, I traced the ghost of my name on the page, feeling the indentations where it once had weight. The watch ticked on, steady, indifferent, as I slid the ledger back into the drawer and shut it with a quiet click. The rain had been steady all morning, tracing long silver lines down the cafe's wide windows, blurring the view of Main Street into a watercolor smear of taillights and gray sky. Birch and Bean was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that let you hear the hiss of the espresso machine from the back counter, and the faint squeak of the ceiling fan turning in lazy circles. I sat in a corner booth, the kind with cracked leather that stuck faintly to your coat, nursing a coffee that had gone lukewarm. Across from me, Gareth Lowell leaned over his mug, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the hum of the radiator. "You've been carrying their books too long, Clive," he said, his eyes flicking to the door, as if Lenora or Marcus might burst through at any second. Gareth had always been deliberate like that, never dramatic, just precise. His hands, still bearing faint ink stains from his days of ledger work, rested on a sealed folder between us. Across its front in his neat block lettering were the words, "Internal Review Draft." I didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, I stared at the condensation pooling at the base of my untouched coffee, tracing a finger along the ring it left on the table. "Tracks?" I asked, finally my voice softer than I'd intended. He nodded, pushing the folder a little closer. "Your sister and Marcus left plenty. Loans funneled through the family foundation. They even dipped into your 401k without a whisper to you. Paperwork says you authorized it, but these signatures..." He flipped the folder open just enough for me to see the blurred copy of a form, my name in a faint scrawl that wasn't mine. These were done by someone else. I exhaled through my nose, feeling the slow, familiar burn of anger that didn't flare so much as coil inside my ribs. I glanced down at the pocket watch in my vest, its reflection dim in the cafe's rain-streaked window. The tick was barely audible here, drowned out by the rain, but I could feel its pulse against my chest. My phone buzzed beside the coffee cup, the vibration rattling the ceramic slightly. A message lit the screen from Naomi Cole, my old assistant, who had vanished from the family office as quietly as I had. "I have backups. I'm scared, but you should know." Her words glowed in that cold blue light, each letter heavy with hesitation. Gareth watched me read it, his expression unreadable, then took a long sip of his coffee before speaking again. "She's smart to be scared. They've built their little kingdom on borrowed ground. People who stand too close when it shifts get buried. But you..." He tapped the folder lightly, the sound crisp against the wood. "You've got more than leverage. You've got the truth." I leaned back, feeling the booth creak beneath me, and let my eyes drift to the fogged-up window where a strand of wet pine from the cafe's wreath brushed the glass with each gust of wind. "So, what do I do?" I asked, though the answer was already circling my mind. Gareth didn't hesitate. "Collect everything. Emails, statements, Naomi's files, whatever you've got, buried in those ledgers of yours. Stay quiet. Don't make noise until you can bring it all down in one strike. One clean shot." He reached across the table, his hand settling on the pocket watch where it bulged beneath my vest. His palm was warm, the weight grounding. "Time will do half the work. The rest is up to My phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. Another message from Naomi I found audio. "Meet me soon." The words felt heavier than the first, a shift from warning to a promise of something sharper. I stared at the screen, the letters swimming slightly in the reflection of the cafe lights. Outside, the rain showed no sign of letting up, drumming a steady rhythm on the awning. I closed my fingers around the watch, feeling its steady tick against my palm, and slid the folder into my bag. Gareth nodded once, a silent agreement between two men who'd seen enough backroom dealings to know when patience was the most dangerous weapon in the room. I rose from the booth, leaving the coffee untouched, and pulled my coat tighter around me. As the door chimed softly and the cold air reached in, I glanced back at Gareth, still seated with his mug steam curling into the dim light. The rain blurred his shape almost immediately when I stepped outside, leaving just the sound of his voice in my head, low and certain. "One strike, Clive." "Don't waste it." The pocket watch ticked on beneath my coat as I walked into the wet wind. Naomi's words still glowing on my screen, a pulse of urgency in my hand. The rain stung against my face, but it didn't matter. Time, for the first time in years, felt like it was on my side. The hum of the fluorescents was the only steady thing in that office, a thin, metallic whine that dug into the back of my skull. Outside, snow tapped against the wide windows in uneven bursts, soft and persistent, as if it wanted to remind me there was still some rhythm in the world beyond this sterile room. I stood near the doorway, hands in my coat pockets, while Lenora leaned over her desk with that smile of hers, sharp and deliberate, like she'd filed it to a point. She plucked my father's silver pocket watch from where it sat on a shelf, turned it once in her hand like she was weighing its worth, and tossed it into a dusty archive box by the file cabinet. The dented cover made a dull thud against the cardboard. "Stay in your lane, Clive," she said, without looking at me. Her tone wasn't raised. It didn't have to be. It carried the same weight as the red-stamped invoice on her desk, the one that showed my 401k listed as collateral for the vineyard's latest renovation loan, a detail she hadn't bothered to mention until the paperwork was already signed. Marcus stood behind her, arms crossed, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was a language of its own, one that said he'd already decided where I belonged. The cursor on her computer blinked as she removed my name from the latest partnership email chain, citing streamlining in the notes. Years of my work, my financial maps and projections vanishing with a few keystrokes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration felt louder than the lights above us. Naomi's name flashed on the screen with a secure message link. I tapped it open and listened through the phone's tiny speaker. Marcus's voice, clear and smug, bled through. "We'll milk Clive's accounts," then cut him out. "Clean break. He'll swallow it like he always does." I caught Marcus glance my way, as if he could sense what I was hearing, and that smirk deepened just a notch. I bent down and lifted the watch from the box. Its cover bore a fresh crease, the second hand frozen between marks, silent, where it used to tick. For a moment, I just held it, the weight of it heavier than it had ever been, the hum of the lights above, stretching the silence around us like a taut wire. Lenora shuffled papers and murmured something to Marcus about timelines, her voice a practiced calm that barely covered the edge beneath it. I slipped the watch into my coat pocket and turned toward the door. The snow's muffled squeak under my shoes, replacing the fluorescent buzz as I stepped into the hall. The phone buzzed again. Naomi, this time, her words stark on the screen. "Meet me tomorrow. Bring Gareth." This could end them. I stood in the corridor, the cold air from the outer doors brushing against my face, and whispered to myself, low enough for no one to hear. Not yet. But soon. The office lights hummed behind me as I pushed through the door and let the snow swallow the sound. The gas station was nearly deserted, a lonely island of pale light against the black stretch of Route 9. The neon sign over the pumps flickered in a stubborn rhythm, casting the lot in alternating hues of blue and white. A vending machine buzzed somewhere near the entrance, its faint hum carried by the sharp wind that whipped through the canopies overhead. Naomi stood by my truck, her coat collar pulled tight, her hands shaking as she slid a tiny USB drive across the cold metal of the hood. Her fingers lingered for a moment, as if letting go of it might take something more than she was ready to give. "It's all there," she whispered, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Her eyes darted toward the road, scanning for headlights that never came. "Recordings, emails, copies of those contracts Marcus signed under your name. Even Lenora, she called you a Zoom uncle, like it was a punchline." Her words stuck, carried on a thin breath that turned to mist between us. I nodded, but didn't pocket the drive right away. The tick of my father's old watch pulsed faintly beneath my coat, each beat a metronome, keeping time with the ache behind my ribs. I glanced at Naomi, the shadows under her eyes, deep from too many sleepless nights. "You sure you're ready for this?" I asked. Her lips parted, then closed again. She gave the faintest shake of her head.
"No, but it's already too late to pretend."
The phone in my other hand buzzed. Gareth's voice came through the line, calm and steady, as always.
"Clive, don't hold it. Get it to the Foundation's Risk Council tonight. Copy the investor directly. Let them make the first move. Quiet hands win this kind of fight."
His voice had a way of cooling my pulse, flattening the heat of the moment into something precise. I finally slid the USB into my coat pocket, the tick of the watch seeming to grow louder with the added weight beside it. Naomi took a step back, hugging her arms to herself, as a gust of wind sent grit skittering across the pavement. "Once they know I talked," she started, but didn't finish. "They won't know it came from you," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure if the truth would care to stay hidden. She nodded once, a quick, sharp motion, and disappeared into the shadows near the edge of the lot. Hours later, back in my office, the hum of the radiator and the faint buzz of the overhead light barely masked the sounds of the night outside. I set a cup of coffee on the desk, its surface sweating a thin ring onto the wood, and connected with Gareth one more time. The files were in the hands of the people who could actually act. By dawn, the investor had frozen every dollar earmarked for Lenora's wedding, and the vineyard renovation the tap shut without warning. My phone lit up on the desk. Lenora's text glared at me. "You just doomed this family." I didn't type a reply. My hands trembled slightly around the warm ceramic of the coffee cup, but no words came. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint creak of the old radiator between the slow, steady ticks of the pocket watch. I placed the USB on the desk directly in front of me and leaned back in the chair. The world outside was nothing but wind against the windows and the distant hum of the vending machine I'd passed hours ago. The watch's ticking filled the room louder than my own breath, louder than the silence. I stared at the small drive, its metallic casing catching the dim light, and let the sound of the watch drown out everything else. The hall smelled of dust and old hymnals, the kind of scent that clung to the oak paneling and lingered in the heavy curtains drawn back from the tall windows. The lights overhead were dim, casting everything in a weak yellow glow that made the room feel more like a relic than a meeting place. Cold air drifted in from the gaps near the windows, and I could feel it on my hands as I adjusted the papers in front of me. The pocket watch in my vest had gone silent again this morning, its hands frozen at 8 minutes past 11, and now the stillness in my chest felt like it matched the stillness in that watch. Lenora's lawyer, a slim man with sharp spectacles and a smile too polite to be sincere, slid a stack of papers across the table.
We believe this settlement will resolve all disputes quickly,
he said, his tone smooth and rehearsed. I didn't look at the numbers. I didn't need to. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the folder while I let my eyes travel over the room. Lenora stood stiff near the end of the table, her jaw set, her hands clenched just out of sight at her sides. Marcus sat 2 seats down, dabbing his forehead with a folded receipt he must have grabbed in a rush, his eyes darting between me and the lead investor, seated opposite. My parents. Etta and Roland were perched on the far side, their faces a mixture of discomfort and the stubborn pride they wore like armor. I pulled the USB from my coat pocket and set it gently on the table. The faint clink of it against the wood drew every eye in the room.
Before we discuss numbers, I said my voice. Even there's something you need to hear.
I slid over a small envelope containing Naomi's signed statement and a printout of the emails confirming that my 401k had been used without my consent as leverage for Lenora's ventures. Gareth, leaning quietly against the wall, folded his arms and nodded once as the lead investor picked up the documents. The USB clicked into a laptop at the head of the table, and Marcus's voice filled the room cool and smug, even through the tinny speakers. We'll drain Clive's accounts, then cut him loose. He'll take it. He always does. The words echoed against the oak, louder than the hum of the radiator. Lenora's face tightened, her eyes flicking to Marcus, then to me, then back to the investor, whose expression had hardened into something colder than the winter air sneaking through the windows. The investor closed the laptop with a soft thud. Effective immediately, he said, turning to Lenora. All backing for your projects is suspended. We'll review our options, but for now, we'll continue with Mr. Reddick. The scrape of chairs shifting echoed as the weight of his words settled. Marcus's hand froze, mid-wipe, the crumpled receipt still pressed to his temple. Lenora turned on me, her voice rising just enough to crack. You're burning this family to the ground, Clive. Everything we built gone because you can't stand not being the center. Her eyes glinted in the dim light fury, cutting through the polished exterior she wore like a second skin. I met her gaze and let the silence stretch until I could hear the wood groan under the shifting weight of someone's chair. No, I said, my voice low and steady. I'm rebuilding it without the rot. For a long moment, no one spoke. The radiator hissed once chairs creaked, and even my parents kept their eyes on the table. Then, from somewhere beneath my vest, the pocket watch's second hand gave a faint jerk, a stuttering twitch that broke the quiet. The next tick came soft but certain, followed by another, until the familiar rhythm returned steady and deliberate. I pushed the settlement folder back across the table, untouched, and stood. The watch ticked on louder than the murmurs starting to rise as I turned toward the door. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be decided in this drafty hall, and it wouldn't be written by anyone but me. Gareth's boots crunched against the icy steps as he made his way up to St. Mary's, the sound sharp in the stillness of a midwinter afternoon. The church hall smelled faintly of pine from the garlands still strung along the windows, though Christmas had long since passed. Inside, the muffled hum of a choir's practice filtered through the heavy wooden doors to the sanctuary, their voices rising and falling like a tide. I sat at a table near the back, pen in hand, the final stack of documents spread out before me. The pocket watch still resting in its jeweler's pouch weighed lightly against my coat. For weeks it had been silent, and now it was nearly ready to run again. Gareth slid into the chair across from me, pulling off his gloves and rubbing his hands together for warmth.
"You've done it,"
he said, nodding toward the papers.
"Funds secured. Investors still behind you. This thing's real now."
His voice carried that steady confidence I'd leaned on through every rough turn. I looked down at the documents, the ink still drying on my signature for the Reddick Community Fund.
"It doesn't feel like revenge anymore,"
I admitted, my voice low.
"Feels like maybe something worth the years I spent being invisible."
He leaned back slightly, his coat creaking, and watched me for a beat before speaking.
"Now they'll remember you, not for noise, but for what you built."
There was no edge in his tone, just a quiet certainty that settled into the hall as naturally as the faint scent of candle wax from the altar beyond. A courier knocked softly on the doorframe, holding a small, velvet-lined box. I signed for it, hands steady, and opened the case on the table. The pocket watch lay nestled inside its polished silver, catching the flicker of the hall's candles. The dent had been smoothed, the mechanism repaired, every detail restored with care. For a moment, I just watched the light play off its surface, the soft glow reflecting in the dark grain of the table. Around us, a few parishioners shuffled in and out, exchanging nods and warm murmurs, their voices blending with the faint strains of the choir beyond the doors. The hall felt different now, not like the drafty, hostile spaces where my family had cornered me, but like a place where something new could actually begin. Gareth pushed the final document toward me, his finger resting on the line where I needed to sign. "Scholarships for kids who never get noticed," he said. "Support for retirees who can't stretch their savings. All in your name, the way it should have been years ago." I signed the page. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper, almost drowned out by the faint harmony of voices from the sanctuary. As I closed the pen, I reached into the jeweler's pouch and lifted the watch. Its case felt warm now, the gears inside ready, but still. Gareth stood tucking his gloves into his coat pocket. "Wind it," he said softly, nodding toward the watch. "Feels right, doesn't it?" I turned the small crown, slowly listening, as the first tick broke through the quiet. Another followed, then another, each one smooth and sure, a rhythm I hadn't heard in months. The choir's song swelled faintly as I held the watch in my palm, its steady beat falling into time with their voices. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't think about the ledger sheets or the emails where my name had been erased. I thought about the lives this fund might touch, the quiet ways it could balance what had been so skewed. I closed my fist gently around the watch, its ticking strong now, and let the sound mingle with the soft echoes of the choir as the candles flickered against the winter gloom. The snow was melting the edges of icy patches, shrinking into muddy puddles as early spring sunlight poured through the wide windows of my modest office. I sat behind my wooden desk, the familiar scent of worn paper and fresh coffee blending softly in the air. Beside the first grant check from the Reddit Community Fund rested my father's restored pocket watch, gleaming in the afternoon light as if reflecting every hard-fought moment that had led here. Beneath the watch lay a sealed envelope, an apology from my parents. Their words remained unread, heavy with the weight of years I wasn't yet ready to unpack. For now, their silence rested quietly beneath the steady tick of time, a small counterpoint to the progress I could hold in my hands. Across from me, 2 teenagers from the scholarship cohort sat with wide eyes and nervous smiles, clutching envelopes that promised more than just money. They held hope. Their bright energy was a stark contrast to the cold, guarded faces I remembered from that tense town hall months ago. Gareth stopped by, his presence steady and reassuring. As always, he raised his chipped coffee cup in a muted toast.
"Here's to fresh starts done right,"
he said, the warmth in his eyes matching the sun pooling across the desk. I smiled softly, watching the flicker of hope in the young faces before me. To more than just noise, I murmured, feeling the weight of every moment behind those words. With a steady hand, I tucked the unopened letter under the watch, choosing peace over confrontation for now. The church bells in the distance began to toll the hour, their muted chime weaving through the quiet room like a benediction. As the last bell faded, I whispered, "Time well spent," and slowly closed the office blinds, casting the room into gentle shadow. The pocket watch ticked steadily on the desk, its rhythm blending with the fading bells, a quiet reminder of the journey behind and the promise ahead. I locked the door behind me and stepped into the afternoon light, leaving both the watch and the unopened letter behind. The ticking carried on, a soft, steady heartbeat, marking a new beginning. As the repaired pocket watch quietly ticks beside the first grant check, I feel a calm settle over what was once a storm. The soft afternoon light in my office filters through, casting warm shadows over the polished silver now whole again, much like this chapter of my life. Justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming my story and building something that outlasts old wounds. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments of repair that we find our true strength. If you've ever faced a fracture in family or life, you know the path isn't easy, but there's always hope in the healing. What moments in your life have surprised you with a second chance when you least expected it? I'd love to hear your stories.